Hello, news fans. It is time to news. There are a lot of important things happening in the world. In Hong Kong, protesters are in a desperate fight for their rights as they're attacked by police. Children are still in cages at ICE detention centers, and Trump is trying to deport kids with life-threatening illnesses. The Amazon rainforest is on fire, and the Bolsonaro government is trying to charge forward with deforestation while trampling on indigenous rights. Radioactive boars are... What's that person just off frame? Bret Stephens' feelings were hurt? Well, forget that dumb stuff we were going to talk about. Bret Stephens, New York Times columnist, climate change skeptic, and champion against safe spaces and college student snowflakes, got called a bedbug on Twitter. I repeat, someone was mean to him on Twitter. Now, this may seem like not news, but believe me, it's a thing. It's a thing that's in the news. So here we go. You see, it all started back in the warm days of late August 2019, when the old New York Times building became infested with bedbugs, or as they like to call them back in the day, the Jiminy Beetles. Now, one of the New York Times editors, Stuart A. Thompson, announced through Twitter, breaking, there are bedbugs in the New York Times newsroom. So the folks of Twitter began a tweeting and a hollering, doing what was known back in the day as a good old-fashioned dragging. Professor of Public Affairs at George Washington University, David Karpf, participated in this Twitter custom by writing, quote, "The bedbugs are a metaphor. The bedbugs are Bret Stephens." To most, this joke was a mild razzing of a columnist who gets paid to write about how climate change isn't so bad, how millennials are whiny snowflakes, and how the answer to complex geopolitics is more nukes. Now, before we get into the bedbug of it all, a quick rundown of Bret Stephens and his good brain and very nice opinions. He's a right-wing conservative. No, he changed that brand to moderate, despite agreeing with, well, basically every right-wing policy, whose catchphrase is essentially, hey guys, can't we all calm down and just not worry so dang much about having health care? And that climate change is no big deal, and trying to stop our planet from becoming a withered husk is being a shrill alarmist. To give you a sense of how deeply entrenched he is in the idea that we should plow forward with regressive policies, in this op-ed he argues that capitalist growth helps offset climate change because rich countries survive natural disasters more. In other words, let's continue to extract wealth from the rest of the world, because after we're done deforesting and mining and burning fossil fuels and exacerbating climate change, even though we'll have screwed over the rest of the world, we'll be fine here on our pile of riches. Because as he states in his op-ed, every child knows that houses of brick are safer than houses of wood or straw. Duh, climate scientists, even babies know that bricks are better than straw. Check. And, you know what? Wait, where's... Mate. He's a champion against such things as taking sexual assault accusations seriously. Take, for instance, this op-ed in which Bret Stephens, the never-Trumper, turns out to be a sometimes Trumper when it means standing up to alleged victims of sexual assault. That's right, Bret Stephens was grateful that Big Bully Trump stood up to those mean people who, believed Christine Blasey Ford might be telling the truth about Brett Kavanaugh, creating reasonable doubt about the man's character, and perhaps one should choose any of the other thousands of judges available for the highest court in the land. It is also a lifetime appointment. Interestingly, while he's very cautious when it comes to believing Christine Blasey Ford's testimony, saying, "I believe Blasey deserves to be fairly heard, not automatically believed," concluding if she can't demonstrate that her charges are true with definitive evidence, then she will have smeared Kavanaugh. But these harsh standards applied to a potential sexual assault victim are relaxed when it comes to believing unproven claims by Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu that Iran is storing atomic materials in a warehouse in Turkuz Abad. Though there's no definitive evidence that this is an atomic warehouse, Stephens doesn't demand that Netanyahu needs to demonstrate his charges are true with definitive evidence, or else he will have smeared Iran. So when Professor David Karpf calls Bret Stephens a bedbug, isn't that a bit extreme? I mean, Stephens is just a New York Times columnist. He latches onto an issue, sucks out all of the important context and meaningful information, and shits out columns like some sort of like a like a tiny parasite, it is on the tip of my tongue. Oh. Anyway, what should have been a one-off Twitter joke has become something of a imbroglio, a kerfuffle, a brouhaha, a snake eating its own tail and vomiting up into its own butt. Bret Stephens then wrote a letter to Professor Karp, CCing Karp's boss, the provost of the university. You see, Bret, millennials are whiny snowflakes, Stephens, was a tad offended by the Twitter joke and wrote, Someone just pointed out a tweet you wrote about me, calling me a bedbug. I'm often amazed about the things supposedly decent people are prepared to say about other people. People they've never met on Twitter. I think you've set a new standard. I would welcome the opportunity for you to come to my home, meet my wife and kids, talk to us for a few minutes, and then call me a bedbug to my face. He added, that would take some genuine courage and intellectual integrity on your part. I promise to be courteous no matter what you have to say. End quote. Okay, so this is a bit hypocritical of the man who once wrote, these younger generations that specialize in histrionic self-pity and moral self-righteousness, who railed against those who recklessly participate in the search and destroy missions of the call-out culture. He's the man who bravely stands against those who have figured out that the quickest way to acquire and exercise power is to take offense. Is he being hypocritical? Yes. Is it hilarious that the champion against safe spaces quit Twitter after being mocked for tattling on Professor Karp? Yes. But who cares? You know, we're all hypocritical at times, probably. I mean, we don't all have New York Times columns in which we relentlessly bash younger generations and scoff at people who care too much about things. But okay. He can dish it out, and he can't take it. At least in that email he wrote to that professor and the professor's boss, that he promised to be courteous no matter what you have to say. At least he didn't backtrack on that promise by saying something ridiculous, like comparing the professor to Goebbels or... Okay, well there it is. In the world's first ever New York Times op-ed that subtweeted someone and compared him to Goebbels, Bret Stephens makes it very clear that being called a bedbug for his terrible op-eds is just as bad as the viciously anti-Semitic, nationalist, and genocidal rhetoric of Nazi Joseph Goebbels. In Bret Stephens' piece, the modern-day victims of this rhetoric are centrists. Quote, the unpopular political figures of our day are the people who seem to convey less than 100% true belief, the moderate conservative, the skeptical liberal, the centrist wobbler. Of course, he briefly mentions that migrants are targeted by racist rhetoric, sparing 11 words on the subject out of a total of 909. Although he doesn't go as far as to mention the fact that children are still in concentration camps on the US border, a slightly more pressing issue than people disliking coffee man Howard Schultz's presidential campaign. In fact, this lip service to migrants is just a vehicle to his real point. That him getting called a bedbug for his bad op-eds is the same thing as fascist propaganda. Now, you may be thinking, Cody, that's a pretty cynical take. And sure, maybe I'm jumping to conclusions. Or maybe Bret Stephens just searched for, quote, Jews as bedbugs, and used the first result he found without actually checking to see if his source supported his point. Apparently, the link in his article takes you to a Google book with the term Jews as bedbugs still entered into the search field. And his own source undermines his point, saying, Professor Jerry Tomaszewski believes that the bedbugs are burning should be taken literally. There was an infestation of bedbugs in Warsaw at the time. The New York Times claims that the link was added by editors before publication to give readers a reference, to which this very smart and also extremely cool guy pointed out, why did editors at the New York Times search for the phrase Jews as bedbugs instead of for the specific quote cited in the column? That stupidity and obvious lie from the New York Times aside, in case it's not clear, here's the difference between the genocidal fascist rhetoric of Goebbels and a joke on Twitter about Bret Stephens being a bedbug. The prior sought to label all Jews and communists as enemies of the state, as dangerous, subhuman criminals, and aimed to bait Jews and communists into conflict, then claimed this violence was a reason to have the government crack down on these very groups. He used his position of power and control of the media to censor any opposition to Hitler, and to control all aspects of culture and intellectualism. Meanwhile, Bret Stephens, a guy with his own New York Times column, was called a bedbug for his op-eds by an associate professor of media and public affairs at GWU. Bret Stephens then used his platform of millions of readers to call the Jewish professor a Nazi. This is actually a pretty interesting fascist move on Stephens' part. Self-victimization from positions of power. But anyway, why is this important? Why are we talking about this? After all, the planet is literally burning right now. Well, the reason that I wanted to talk about Bret Stephens and media figures like him is that he latches onto the public consciousness and sucks attention away from more important issues, like a parasitic creature that is on the tip of my tongue. Anyways, his writings on how complacency is equivalent to reasonableness, and that somehow caring too much about the world and the environment is irrational, embed themselves into the media by rebranding centrism and moderation as the radical viewpoint. They assuage readers who may be anxious about the state of the world, say global warming or wealth inequality, that actually everything's okay, that it's fine to be ambivalent, or perhaps even noble to be. That if someone tries to tell you that something needs to be done, that the situation is dire, they're a shrill alarmist, and you can meet them with a cool, rational indifference. This kind of philosophy is a mental sedative, blocking critical thinking in favor of, this is fine, everything's fine, even if your skin is itching all over and you're noticing bite marks everywhere. It's the kind of philosophy that is so seductive, it entrenches itself deeply under the skin of our culture, and is almost impossible to remove, like a small creature that I'm sure I will think of. I will think of it. I will think of the word. Anyway, after getting called a bedbug, Bret Stephens has made a number of media appearances about the op-ed where he subtweets the guy he's mad at, and continues to have his gigantic platform. And this isn't the first time that he's used his position of power to punch down at his critics on Twitter. Last month, he compared mean tweets to him to the French Reign of Terror. He starts his piece out with this touching anecdote. I was walking through an airport terminal trying to catch a connecting flight last Saturday when I spotted a writer I had never met, but whose work I admire. He greeted me with a look of fatherly concern. Sorry about what's happening to you on Twitter, the writer told Bret. His op-ed was about how he was attacked by Reza Aslan, a writer who said, "Holy moly, Bret Stephens jumps out of the white nationalist closet here with all his 'they are not us' bullshit. Wowzers." Stephens found this to be Orwellian, and that he, owner of his own New York Times column and guest on MSNBC and CNN, was one of the many victims of the self-silencing of much of America. I mean, okay, Mr. Compare My Critics to Goebbels is being a tad hypocritical, but I don't think the discussion should end at how Stephens is a hypocrite. Although the extent to which he is a massive hypocrite is kind of funny. He had a whole column defending bad tweets and says, "Let he who is without a bad tweet cast the first stone." Of course, unless you're attacking him, in which case you're a, Goebbels or an Orwellian horseman of the apocalypse. The issue is that Bret Stephens, with all of his talk of discourse and his screeds on free speech and his rants on speech we shouldn't have because I don't like it, work as a smokescreen, a way to shift the argument from whether his opinions are bad to how he's the brave canary in a coal mine, vanguard of the public discourse. But this valiant champion of civility and raising the bar of public commentary is actually himself a pretty rude boy, whose New York Times published sermons about being reasonable all boil down to how we shouldn't care about certain people. Take Reza Aslan's commentary on how Bret Stephens jumped out of the white nationalist closet. Is that an inflammatory tweet? Absolutely. And that's where Bret Stephens wants the conversation to huddle around. But let's actually take a look at that op-ed Aslan is referring to. The opinion piece is about the first Democratic debate, and he has some reservations. It starts with a phrase written in Spanish, which he glibly translates. This will be important later. Then he starts talking about the problems with the Democratic Party, namely that they are a party that makes too many Americans feel like strangers in their own country, a party that puts more of its faith and invests most of its efforts in them instead of us. Emphasis not mine. Who's them? Who's us? Well, as Stephens continues, they speak Spanish. We don't. And boom goes the racist dynamite. The worst kind of dynamite. Yes, we, the ordinary Americans, read true Americans, are not the same as them, the people who speak Spanish. Dora the Explorer, you are not welcome here. Stephens isn't done, though. They are not U.S. citizens or legal residents. We are. They broke the rules to get into this country. We didn't. They pay few or no taxes. We already pay most of those taxes. They willingly got themselves into debt. We're asked to write it off. They don't pay the premiums for private health insurance. We're supposed to give up ours in exchange for some VA-type nightmare. They didn't start enterprises that create employment and drive innovation. We're expected to join the candidates in demonizing the job creators, breaking up their businesses, and taxing them to the hilt? Us. And them. Us good, and they bad. He even talks about the third worldization of America. And remember that part of the intro, that snide Spanish translation? He's essentially parroting the xenophobic rhetoric of white supremacists, the white genocide, the fear that scary brown people will take over America and transform it into a third world country, i.e. one that isn't dominantly white. This is eerily similar to the Great Replacement and white genocide rhetoric of full-blown white supremacists. Now, aside from all that, there are some slight factual inaccuracies in what he's saying. They broke the rules to get into this country. Well, sometimes migrants come to apply for asylum in the U.S., which is allowed, and we're actually breaking the rules by turning them away. Also, when he says we didn't break the rules, what does he mean? There were no rules to even break back before the 1880s and the Chinese Exclusion Act, which was a way to keep Chinese people out of the US because we've always been kind of super racist and our country is built on white supremacy. And if by rules he means rules of native people living in the land, as in the rule not to kill the native people living here, whoops. Then he says they pay few or no taxes. Well, first of all, undocumented immigrants pay taxes, just like citizens do. About 6 million undocumented immigrants pay income taxes. Undocumented immigrants often pay Social Security benefits into citizens' accounts whose Social Security numbers they're using. And all immigrants pay sales taxes. So, you know, that's more than few or no taxes. And hey, many more undocumented immigrants would pay taxes if, you know, we didn't terrorize them with ICE deportation raids. He also says they willingly got themselves into debt. And now he's just being silly. And hey, racist too. Now he's ascribing personality faults to them, human beings that he wants us to think willingly would get themselves into debt, something no reasonable person would do, because Stephens doesn't want us to think of them as reasonable people. He continues, they didn't start enterprises that create employment and drive innovation. Again, this could be found straight from Stormfront. The idea that because they, the brown immigrants, haven't built civilization, that we, white people, did, ignoring our history of destroying and colonizing other civilizations, cough, cough, Native Americans, ignoring our very recent history of funding coups and selling arms in South America, causing violence and poverty in regions where immigrants are fleeing from. Also, he implies that they will never be capable of starting enterprises, that nobody coming from Mexico and South America could be innovators. In other words, they are inferior to us. They are leeches on our society, which is, it's kind of white supremacist. Rebranded to be about legality and illegality, even though white-collar criminals, those rich people who start enterprises that create employment and drive innovation, are not dehumanized in the same way. So maybe it's not a stretch to say this op-ed is evocative of white supremacist rhetoric. Maybe instead, Bret Stephens is couching his abhorrent opinions under the banner of self-declared civility, using it as a mask to hide his ugly message. Then he turns around and calls out someone making a joke about him being a bedbug as being like Goebbels. But him, portraying migrants as despicable, lazy, and indolent others? No, that's polite, civil writing. Bret Stephens would probably hand-wave this criticism away by claiming that in this op-ed, he was merely referencing what he thinks other people are thinking, the so-called ordinary Americans. In his response piece, where he compares his critics to Robespierre's Reign of Terror, he says, Reza Aslan, who had accused me of jumping out of the white nationalist closet for a column that attempted to channel the negative way ordinary people might have viewed last week's Democratic debates. So either he's saying that he believes that most ordinary people hold racist white supremacist views, or he's just using weasel words to shield himself from any criticism of his racist writing. But hey, ¿por qué no los dos? Bret Stephens probably does think that the silent majority holds racist views. And so does he. Because once he slipped up and forgot to use the whole everybody else is thinking it smokescreen. In 2016, he wrote an op-ed for the Wall Street Journal in which he decried the disease of the Arab mind, writing, so long as an Arab athlete can't pay his Israeli opposite the courtesy of a handshake, the disease of the Arab mind and the misfortunes of its world will continue. He is so fond of this idea of the Arab mind and how it's diseased, he repeated it on PragerU, a fake university, in 2017, saying, the Arab world's problems are a problem of an Arab mindset, with this handy anatomical diagram of the Arab brain. Yes, that is in fact an illustration of a bearded man wearing a white taqiyya hat, typically worn by Muslims, with his brain helpfully labeled Arab mindset, with an arrow pointing to it labeled problem. Side note, anyone willfully appearing in a PragerU video should be taken seriously regardless of anything else they've ever done. And this isn't the only instance of Bret Stephens' racist, violent rhetoric. Back in 2017, before any of this bedbug drama, Adam Johnson wrote an article for In These Times in which he contends that, far from being a moderate, Bret Stephens holds far-right views. Johnson summarizes some of Stephens' opinions, writing, Stephens has referred to anti-Semitism as the disease of the Arab mind, insisted Palestinians have a blood fetish and bloodlust, said Black Lives Matter was a lie based on the myth of victimization, labeled institutionalized racism another imaginary enemy, called climate change hysteria and a religion without God, and in a piece subtly headlined, I am not sorry the CIA waterboarded, contended Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in fact waterboarded himself by not being truthful with his captors. So Bret Stephens labels himself as a civil, reasonable person, sneaking into the comfortable sheets of the New York Times, laying in wait until an unsuspecting person untucks those sheets, at which point he bores under their skin, embedding his far-right racist opinions within the pretext of reasonableness, like some kind of tiny, biting bug one might find in sheets. Fuck, what is it? All right. The point of this piece isn't to just rip on Bret Stephens, although he definitely deserves it, and it's definitely funny. It's to really examine the practice of batting away criticism with one hand, yelling, civility, civility, while with the other hand, calling immigrants lazy leeches and talking about the disease of the Arab mind. There's also another point that often gets lost. The pearl clutching over how mean Twitter is to him, and seeing this as a cultural shift towards oversensitivity, an Orwellian nightmare, as Stephens puts it. He even compares Twitter to Hitler's use of the radio, saying, radio then, like Twitter today, was the technology of the id, a channel that could concentrate political fury at a time when there was plenty to go around. Here's the thing about Twitter. In many cases, it can absolutely be a troll-filled hellhole, with real harassment, like calling people ethnic slurs and threatening violence. But it's also filled with millions of other people who have opinions that aren't harassment. For instance, calling out an op-ed writer for his egregious It's also one of the few places where the general public can directly address the statements of those with powerful platforms. So it's not so much that the public has become hypersensitive to blowhards like Bret Stephens, but that now people can actually directly communicate with these towering media giants, voicing their concerns in what is known as a ratio. Anyways, Bret Stephens, who has likely grown accustomed to not being called on his petty, hateful crap, clearly, as his editors don't seem to be going, "Hey Bret, maybe don't use the New York Times to subtweet some guy you're mad at." So when he's finally called on his bad opinions, it feels like he's under attack. It really gets under his skin, like a tiny creature that feeds on bedbugs. That's what they're called. Bedbugs. Sorry. You're a bedbug, Bret. Please don't email my boss. Which I guess is technically me, like Katy, like our patrons, I guess. Here are our patrons' names. Roll the credits. Oh no, I've got a case of the New York Times columnists. Thanks for watching, Bret Stephens specifically. Please email my boss or me. It would be very funny. And thanks for everybody else for watching. You're the real heroes. Do all the YouTube stuff, like and subscribe and so on. Make sure to listen to our podcast, Even More News. Check out our patreon.com/somemore news if you'd like to support us. And also, we've got merch, which is linked. It's like a TeePublic kind of thing. And honestly, hi. Hello.